Okay. All right. So we are starting in the middle of the chapter, A New World. We are starting on page 177, and we are skipping all the parts of the New World about Columbus and sailing and all of that. And we're just focusing on the interaction with Hernan Cortez and Mesoamerica. All right, so we're starting at the top of page 177, right? First full paragraph. One conqueror in particular, a former student of law named Hernando Cortez, was possessed by the wildest ambition. He wanted to march deep into the heart of the country and seize all its legendary treasures. In 1519, he left the coast at the head of 150 Spanish soldiers, 13 horsemen, and a few cannons. The Indians had never seen a white man before, nor had they seen a horse. Horrified by the cannons, they were convinced that the Spanish bandits were powerful magicians or even gods. Still, they made many brave attempts to defend themselves, attacking the soldiers by day as they marched in and their camp at night. But from the outset, Cortez took terrible revenge, setting fire to villages and killing Indians in their thousands. Before long, messengers came from a mighty king whose country lay further inland. They begged him to turn back and give him magnificent gifts of gold and feathers of many colors. But the gifts only served to increase his curiosity and his greed. So on he marched, enduring unimaginable hardships and forcing many Indians into his army, as great conquerors had always done. At last he came to the kingdom of the mighty king who had sent the messengers with their gifts. The king's name was Montezuma, and his land was called Mexico, as was his capital city. Montezuma waited respectfully for Cortez and his small force outside the city, which stood on an island at the center of a great chain of lakes. The Spaniards were astonished when they were led across a long causeway into the city and saw the splendor, beauty, and might of this great capital that was as big as any city in Europe. It had wide, straight streets and a great number of canals and bridges, and there were many squares and great marketplaces to which tens of thousands of people came each day to buy and sell. In his report to the King of Spain, Cortez wrote, "Here they trade in all kinds of merchandise, in foodstuffs and in jewelry made of gold, silver, pewter, brass, bone, mussel, and lobster shell, and feathers, in cut and uncut gems, in lime and brick, in timber, both rough and prepared. In some streets," he says, "they sell nothing but birds and animals of all kinds, while in others they sell infinite varieties of plants." He talks of pharmacies and barber shops, bakeries and inns, merchants selling rare garden plants and fruits, utensils and pigments for painting, and how in the marketplace 3 judges always sat, ready to settle any dispute as it rose. And he describes the city's monumental temples, each in itself as big as a town, with all their tall towers and brightly decorated rooms covered in huge and terrifying depictions of gods to whom dreadful human sacrifices were made. He was particularly impressed by Montezuma's royal palace. Spain, he said, had nothing to compare with it. This palace was several stories high, raised on pillars faced with jasper, its vast halls enjoying views as far as the eye could see. Beneath it stretched a fine park with bird ponds and a great zoo in which all sorts of wild animals were caged. Montezuma was attended by a sumptuous court of high-ranking officials who showed him the greatest difference. And he changed his dress 4 times a day, always preparing in new and different robes never to be worn again. One approached him with one's head bowed, and when he was carried through the streets of Mexico, themselves to the ground before him and must never be seen to look upon his face. Cortez used guile to trap this mighty sovereign. As if paralyzed by their disrespect and insolence, Montezuma didn't lift a finger against the white intruders, for according to an ancient saying, white gods, sons of the sun, would one day come from the east to take possession of Mexico, and Montezuma believed the Spaniards to be these gods. In fact, they behaved more like white devils. They took advantage of a ceremony in a temple to attack and kill all the Mexican nobility, knowing that they would be unarmed. And in the ensuing revolt, Cortes forced Montezuma to appeal to the angry crowds from the palace roof, but the people ignored him. They hurled stones at their own king, and Montezuma fell, mortally wounded. In the carnage that followed, Cortes demonstrated his true courage, for by some miracle, this little band of Spaniards fled the town in all its uproar and, carrying the sick and wounded, made their way back to the coast through that hostile land. Of course, he soon returned with fresh troops, and they burned and destroyed the whole of that magnificent city. And that was only the beginning. There and in other parts of America, the Spaniards proceeded to exterminate the ancient cultivated Indian peoples in the most horrendous way. This chapter in the history of mankind is so appalling and so shameful to us Europeans that I would rather not say anything more about it. I'm going to pause right there. I know I have one more paragraph, but actually in the last chapter of this book, he repeals this statement that I just read. Meanwhile, I'm continuing. Meanwhile, the Portuguese had discovered the true sea route to the Indies, where their behavior was little better than that of the Spaniards. All the wisdom of ancient India meant nothing to them. They too wanted gold, and nothing else would do. In the end, so much gold reached Europe from India and America that burghers grew richer and richer as the knights and landowners grew poorer and poorer. And because all the ships sailed out westwards and returned from the west, it was Europe's western ports that benefited most and grew in power and importance. Not only those of Spain and Portugal, but the ports of France and England and Holland as well. However, Germany played no part in these overseas conquests, for they had far too many problems to deal with at home. All right, and that's the end of the chapter. Okay. I would love to also read the chapter on this that is in A Little History of the United States. It's a bit more graphic in detail, so I might do that. And you can find your student copy of this in classrooms under the heading text.